Our general approach to doing AI ethics to make sure that AI is on the ethical up and up is all, well, it's just kind of screwed up. That's what John Basl of Northeastern says. He's a philosophy professor there. He thinks that, and I think he's probably right about this, is that our approach is generally too narrow. We make improvements when we're doing AI ethics, and it's common to say things like the data scientists and engineers need to learn from the ethicists. The ethicists need to learn from the data scientists and engineers. And we cover some of that ground, but it's just too narrow. The bigger picture, John argues, is that what we really need is not just these two kinds of groups learning from each other, but we need what he calls an AI ethics ecosystem. It's the kind of ecosystem that is similar to the ethics ecosystem in medicine or healthcare. So in that space, we have institutional review boards to review research before there's any testing on human subjects. We have ethics committees at hospitals. We have lots of education of, let's say, doctors coming up through the educational system at medical school, having medical ethics training. So there's this whole ecosystem, regulations, policies, education in the healthcare space. And we need a similar kind of thing in the AI space. There's different elements to this ethics ecosystem that he's calling for, including, just like in healthcare, regulations and education. We also need, at that sort of role level, the level at which individual data scientists, engineers, and people in risk and compliance are working, we need checklists and we need workflow augmentation. We need all sorts of things like that. So that's one thing that I really want you to listen to in this conversation. You should hear the parts where he says data scientists need to learn from ethicists and ethicists need to learn from data scientists. But this is just a smaller part of the overall picture of a need to build an AI ethics ecosystem. Okay, so that's what this conversation is about. It's about thinking about the big picture of AI ethics. Do we have the right goal, the right vision in mind for what AI ethics should look like as it unfolds over the next years and decades? And are we fruitfully pursuing that vision? John thinks that at the moment, we're not really doing a good job and we need to do better. Okay, if you haven't realized it yet, I am the host of this podcast, Reed Blackman. The podcast is called Ethical Machines. If you like it, do the things you're supposed to do. Rate it, 5 stars, review it, share it with your friends, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. You can also check me out at reedblackman.substack.com. I also have a book called Ethical Machines. And that's enough about me. Let's go listen to John. You have an interesting proposition. It's that the way that we're doing AI ethics is all sorts of screwed up. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I don't think just in the standard philosopher way where philosophers just think everyone's wrong about everything.
Right.
I think I mean something slightly different. Yeah, I guess the thing I would say is something like we continue to see not just when people deploy an AI tool that it has ethical impacts that we're unhappy about. Even when we're trying to do ethical AI, even when we're putting resources into that, we just keep running into the same ethics mistakes over and over again. I'm happy to chat about what I think recurring ones are. But
yeah,
the real thing we're wrong about is the lessons we are learning from those things. Like we keep drawing a set of lessons from the mistakes we make. And I just think they're the wrong lessons because they're oriented towards specific solutions when the solution is what I would call building an ecosystem to manage these problems.
Okay, so maybe it's not the standard philosophical sort of everyone is wrong about everything, but you did give the very standard philosopher's extremely abstract characterization of the nature of the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, put some color in this. What are some of the examples of things gone awry? What lessons did we erroneously draw? Maybe not erroneously drawn, maybe they're the correct lessons, but we misapply the lessons learned. What's going on?
Yeah, great. Let me just give an example of like first starting with an ethics like thing that happened. Like we put some resources into trying to solve an ethical problem, but we still messed it up. So I don't know if your audience knows about this, but Google released a Gemini image generation tool. Immediately, someone asked it to generate figures from Nazi Germany, and it generated people of color and minorities as Nazis.
Yeah, black Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. And then the criticism was it was woke. But Google actually put a lot of time into making this model sort of fair or responsive. The problem before was if you asked for an image, you got all white dudes.
Yeah,
We're trying to address that ethical problem. And it's a really hard problem to navigate that correctly because it's hard to ground these models. So that's just like one example where we're spending ethics resources and we're still getting it wrong. And I think I'm going to give you 4 kinds of ethical pain points. First, we want to solve an ethics problem. We take some other area has an ethics tool for solving that problem in another area. We grab that tool, we deploy it, and it messes up. Example, privacy or anonymization in clinical research. anonymizing people's birth certificate, birth date, social security number, all those things, it really does protect individuals in traditional clinical contexts.
Mhm.
Big data analytics, we do not need your birth date. We do not need your social security number to track you and make invasive inferences about you. So taking that tool
Sure.
off the shelf, deploying it in this context just fails us ethically, but we keep doing it for totally decent reasons. There's already been a lot of time spent on a tool. It's supposed to help protect and promote a certain set of values. Why can't I just pull it off the shelf?
Let me make sure I understand this. Okay, you've got some tool that anonymizes or deletes or something along those lines that blocks access to patient data. And then you want to use that. Let's say you're just a tech company, maybe not even in a healthcare setting. You also want to protect people's data. So you use that same tool. I take it there the problem is not that they're using that tool off the shelf, but that the tool's not sufficient to the task, right?
That's right.
That there are other ways of identifying people through whatever. There's just lots of other variables that you can use to figure out who are we talking about here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So like by
Okay.
taking the tool off the shelf, we built a thing that was supposed to promote and protect autonomy and privacy. And we went from that value to a specific tool. Then we
Yeah.
deploy that tool in name in a new context, but it wasn't built to protect those values in that context. So it fails. So that's
Right.
one kind of pain point.
Sure.
Using off the shelf solutions without making sure they're fit to task, as you put it.
Sure.
Second kind of failure is what I'm going to call technical insensitivity. When you bring philosophers to help solve ethical problems in this space, they come, but I don't know if you know this about philosophers, we're not the tech savviest group.
Not so much.
Yeah, and our not understanding sort of the basics of machine learning has led to some what I would think of as really bad ethical theorizing in the space. Easiest, most well-known example is the case of autonomous vehicles and the trolley problem. So
Go on. Yep.
for those of your audience that don't know, philosophers have this thing called the trolley problem, and we have these things
Sure.
called trolley cases. A train is running down the tracks. It's going to hit 5 people. A bystander could pull a switch, and if it does, it'll divert it onto another track where it kills 1. People notice that autonomous vehicles could get in accidents that look a lot like trolley cases. And philosophers got really excited about this, and the popular media got really excited about this. What lessons can we take from the trolley cases for how to program autonomous vehicles?
Yeah.
It's like for the first time since Aristotle that anyone's reached out to philosophers about it.
Yep. Philosophers were very excited about this. We're relevant. I mean, you're not, but they thought so. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly what
Yeah.
happened. And then that spawned a whole literature on whether it was an okay use of the trolley cases or not. But it was mostly on theoretical grounds. Like, is it okay to use thought experiments for theorizing? The real problem is that's not how the technology works. You don't program discrete scenarios in autonomous vehicles. You enable behaviors through training regimes. So you got to answer questions like, what should my training regime look like? What should my validation regime look like? Those are all ethical questions that precede any particular behaviors. And if you understand the technology, you deploy the tools there and not at the level of specific behaviors.
It's funny. It's actually just a different version of the first problem. The first problem is you take these tech solutions off the shelf and you apply it to a context for which it's not suited. In the second case, you take a philosopher's tool, a certain kind of thought experiment, the trolley problem, and try to apply to the context, and it's not fit for that context. So it's two sides of the same coin.
That's right. We're about to get the third side of that same coin.
That's which only in philosopher's land could there be a third side to the coin.
That's right. And
this is the edge. The edge is it has depth.
Good. Maybe the first one's the edge, because this I think is literally the flip side of the same coin, which is what I'm going to call ethical insensitivity. And by that, I don't mean technical people who don't care about ethics. The people I work with, and maybe it's self-selection, but they do genuinely care about getting these problems. But they have no background in normative theorizing or ethics or appreciation of deep ethical issues. So they tend, for reasons that what's in their power is technical solutions. They develop technical solutions to these problems of fairness or privacy or explainability in AI, but they're largely insensitive to deep normative issues. Like, I don't know if your audience knows much about the fairness metrics debate. There's different ways you could implement fairness in a model. And there's been lots of fighting about what's the right fairness metric or how do we between fairness.
Yeah, there's like 24 plus metrics, quote unquote, definitions, mathematical, quote unquote, definitions of fairness.
That's right.
But then there's a substantive question about what's the appropriate one for this particular use case.
And whether one is an appropriate thing to use at all in a particular case, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And those are substantive normative matters, and they're extremely context sensitive. And philosophers have tools for thinking about that issue. Yeah. And they're just not deployed in this case. So that's why I think that's the like exact flip side of the technical insensitivity. Yeah. Is the ethical insensitivity.
I completely agree that technologies are not sensitive to the fact that relevant background here is that those metrics for fairness are not all compatible with each other. So if you score well on one, you necessarily have to score poorly on another. And that's what opens up this question, all right, then which one should we use? And most, data scientists are not, as you said, adept at engaging in fruitful, substantive, normative inquiry to figure out what's the appropriate one. The one thing that I do think, though, is that I actually think that in this context, what's the appropriate metric is the wrong question. That is the academic question. And academics, as you can spend literally years arguing over one case about of the 20 whatever metrics, what's the right one? I actually think that the right question in the context of actual testing for fairness of a model in, let's say, a business context is what are the inappropriate ones? The great question is of the set of metrics we have available, what are the inappropriate ones? What are the ones that are just off the table that are clearly wrong? As opposed to what are the set of fairness metrics about which reasonable people could disagree? And then I think once you can identify the set about which reasonable people disagree, then I think given time constraints, given other kinds of resource constraints like the intellectual background to engage in the full inquiry, but also you've got the contract to do, you've got your deliverable due date. I think at that point, it's ethically permissible to choose arbitrarily among those r- fairness metrics about which reasonable people would disagree and just choose the one that is most compatible with other kinds of things that you're looking to do, maximize accuracy of the model or something like that.
I think largely agree, but I want to say something
Yeah.
slightly too important. One point which I definitely disagree, and then one point where so I think you're right. We just adopt a procedure that sort of helps us sort good models to bad, and whatever comes out of that procedure is permissible. So I think whether or not it's choosing the ones over there which is most disagreement, or maybe what your procedure decide is this is not a fairness metric appropriate context, like the
Yep.
kind of thing we
Sure.
care about is not measuring distributions, but something procedural fairness itself.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
The thing I think we really need to keep in focus, though, is that we should not care about fair models. We care about fair decisions. The appropriate locus of evaluation is the decision making, which is often a hybrid thing. So what we should be applying fairness metrics to is decision systems and not models. You could have a model that satisfies calibration or whatever fairness metric you prefer, but when you integrate it
Yeah.
with the human decision maker, it throws off that.
Yeah. Yes. No, we're in total agreement on that. I like to tell people that, first of all, we should care less about outputs than we should about outcomes, right? There's the output of the AI model, but there's the outcome that is the result of the model being deployed in such and such a way. In some of those cases, in many of those cases, there is a human in the loop. So there's an output by an AI, a human does something with it. And that itself, the AI plus the human, or humans, or whatever, is itself a system that needs to be assessed for blah, 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 right? Just like ethically assessed, including assessed for fairness. And so it's too narrow a focus to talk about the fairness of the model because all you're talking about there is, at best, the fairness of the outputs, but not the fairness or the justness of the outcome. And you're not evaluating the right system. That's the other thing. It's like when you're thinking about let's compare the AI to humans. No, there's three systems. There's the AI by itself, complete automation. There's the human by him or herself. And then there's the third system is the AI plus the human. And what's the appropriate threshold for safe deployment, let's say ethically safe deployment of the AI, will depend upon the safety of the system, not just the safety of the model just sitting there in isolation. Yeah, maybe the model by itself is really shitty and you shouldn't deploy it. It's worse than the average human, or it's worse than the best humans at, let's say, diagnosing illness or something like that. But if it turns out that if the system is AI plus human and we can test that system against AI alone and human alone, and it turns out to perform better, that's what we're looking for here.
1,000%. Yeah. And I think that perspective it sounds obvious when you say it, but I think it's genuinely transformative. So people worry about trade-offs in decision making. Like Sina Fazalpour, one of my colleagues in philosophy, he really adopts the relevant metric of evaluation is the socio-technical system. And then sometimes trade-offs disappear. Like you can demand high accuracy and explainability, or high accuracy and fairness, because you get to draw on the multiple components of the decision-making system rather than just thinking about trade-offs within a model.
Spell that out more. Let's give an example. That's super abstract.
Yeah, that is super abstract. So like we worry about trade-offs between accuracy of a model and fairness of a model. But let's say you integrate a sort of recidivism prediction tool into a decision-making system in a particular way. You can optimize for accuracy of your machine learning model and combat fairness concerns by how you integrate that with the parole boards making the decisions.
Let me spell out the example in more detail. I think the one that you're driving at, which is something like, okay, you want to predict the likelihood that someone's going to commit a crime, recommit a crime. Let's say it's you said it was a parole board.
Yeah, parole board.
So there's a criminal defendant or there's a prisoner up for parole. You've got these AI models that predict the likelihood that they'll commit a crime, let's say in the next 2 years, like the old Compass software. Yep. Maybe it's not so old anymore, or maybe it's still in use, scarily enough. Anyway, so it predicts the likelihood that they're going to commit a crime in the next 2 years. And one thing that you might really care about is that this thing gets it right, that it's accurate. The other thing that you might, and not just accurate, but at a bare minimum, you might think it's got to be at least as, if not more accurate than the average parole board, or maybe even the best parole board, something along those lines.
Yep.
And then you might think that you also should care about fairness. So you want it to be the case that the judgments that you're making
don't disproportionately disadvantage Black defendants. Yeah.
Exactly. So they don't discriminate against Black prisoners. And then I take it your point is, if you look at the model level, you might think that in order to get the right distributions of parole, we have to trade off between accuracy and fairness because, okay, according to this thing, it's most accurate if it might put more Black people in jail or keep more Black people in jail than white people. But that's going to be unjust, arguably anyway. And so we start messing with the model to make it the case that fewer Black people relative to white people are kept in prison, but that might decrease the accuracy metric. And then I take it your point is, chill, or at least potentially, you could just maximize accuracy. Don't worry about tweaking it so that it keeps more Black people or less more Black people free, but take that model and then create the proper kind of training for the parole board to say, listen, this thing is super accurate. That said, it skews towards favoring giving white people parole over Black people. And that should be taken into consideration when you are deliberating about the particular case at hand and when you're thinking about what to do with the AI's output.
You got it. Yeah. Now, I don't know if I want to take that substantive, like bringing it back to the main point, like the normative issues there are extremely complex.
Yeah.
We actually want to sit down and work through it in an applied context and have the right stakeholder in there to figure out what the right trade-offs are. Because it may be that we shouldn't actually do that, but that's an example of how we might do it. But it's an example of the normative depth of these issues that when we deploy technical solutions.
So I have a couple of questions that are on the sort of what should practitioners do side of things. It's funny, two philosophers talking about what should the practitioners do. One is, can you give an example of a case where we should decide we shouldn't use any of these metrics? We talked about that, right? This is not the kind of thing for which we should be applying a fairness metric. That's one question I have. The other question I have is something like, I guess, what's the upshot of the sort of conversation that we just had? There are going to be cases in which you don't need to do this trade-off thing. The primary target of evaluation should be the system that's causing the outcome as opposed to just the little model that's in that system. What is your view on what practitioners should do about that? Abandon those bias metrics? Or is it, all right, let's think a little bit more about how it's going to be deployed actually and decide whether or not we should be using the fairness metrics at all? So I don't know. What do you have to say about those things?
Great question. So I think, despite the thing I'm going to say in a minute, I think I can give an example where we shouldn't care about fairness metrics. Just anything where we think the dominant decision is procedural and there's certain kinds of people that should make a decision. So like trial by jury, we want to make sure that guilty verdicts are handed out proportionally by whatever fairness metric. But that's not how we think of appropriate jury trials. Is it decided by the relevant jury of your peers in a particular kind of procedure? Like any context where you think the position of the decision maker, them exercising their decision-making capacities in a particular way is essential to procedural fairness, is a case where you're not going to want to impose a distribution-based metric.
Right. Again, just to make sure that I've got it right, and once more for the audience, it's all these fairness metrics are saying, okay, look, we've got some goods or services. Maybe it's a mortgage, maybe it's admittance to a university, maybe it's a job interview, maybe it's probation, whatever. We've got these goods and services that we're distributing across these large populations. And the distribution has been done, at least on the screen, on the computer screen, so to speak. We've done the distribution. And then we might wonder, have we distributed this in a fair and just way? And that's when we wheel in these metrics to see if it is done, if the output or the outcome rather is fair or not. But I take it your point is, look, sometimes it's true that we judge outcomes as fair, but sometimes it's just the procedure. If the right procedure has been followed, then the outcome is fair by virtue of the procedure being fair. So here's a nice little toy example. My kids want to split. This is a standard thing, right? Kids want to split, let's say, a candy bar. Let them split it. And one person gets to cut, right? One person makes the cut, the other person chooses. So the first person who's making the cut is highly incentivized to try to do it 50-50, but they're going to be off a little bit. It's going to be 55-45 or whatever. But at any rate, the outcome is fair, even if one gets a little bit more than the other, because the procedure was fair. And so your point, I take it, is that more generally, there are cases in which we don't judge the fairness of the outcome by virtue of how things are distributed, but we judge the fairness of the outcome by virtue of whether the process by which the outcome was brought about, whether that was fair. And so right off the bat,
distributional facts might be relevant to that. Like we find out that the people splitting up the pie are always disadvantaging people, particularly. That might be like, oh, people are not being procedural. So it could be evidence of unfairness.
It's evident,
yeah, but it's not going to constitute what's gone wrong in the case.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. So, sorry. Go ahead.
Practitioners, you want to know about what to do by practitioners?
Given that What in an ideal world, I think what would probably happen, tell me if I'm wrong about this, is you'd have someone like, frankly, like us. You have philosophers or ethicists join the practitioners and say, okay, listen, we want to think about the system as a whole, et cetera, et cetera. That's a big lift. I think that would be a good thing, but it's a big lift for most organizations. As a matter of fact, I work with a lot of clients and they're just like, we don't have budget for new headcount. We're just not going to hire more people.
Totally.
So we've got the existing resources that we have. We can upskill, we can train, et cetera, et cetera. Although that's also limited. You're not going to get them for a weekend workshop or something like that, let alone a class once a week. And so you've got the data scientists and engineers and maybe risk people and legal people that you've got.
Yeah.
Do we try blob mediocre version of upskilling these people to turn them into ethicists, which sounds about as absurd as trying to make me an engineer over the course of a 1-hour compliance module?
Yeah, I appreciate the skepticism about that solution and share it. And this is where I think like the point of the pain points is like, these are the lessons people draw from the pain points. I didn't mention the last one, which is lack of stakeholder engagement, but
We can talk about that. We can return to that one.
Yeah, sure. The lessons people draw from these pain points are things like make sure that the people doing the normative work understand the technical system, make sure the ethicists understand the technology, make sure the technical people understand ethics, think socio-technically, engage stakeholders. Like these are the kind of lessons people draw. And that's first of all, we can't, given the scale of deployment of AI, we can't hope to possibly, if you gave me $1 billion, I could not realize those things. Like there aren't enough of me to send out into the world.
Totally.
So that's not going to work.
But there could be, even if there were enough, and there could be enough, there's no political will for that to happen by the organizations that need to do it. And you're also talking about, to your point, you're talking about lots of organizations. Forget about putting generative AI to the side. Hundreds of models, thousands of models, tens of thousands of models, and you're going to have an ethicist weighing in on each one of them, or maybe just the high risk ones. But even still, like this, that's a lot of
philosophical discipline. If that's what we ended up with,
it would be good. It'd be a nice jobs program, but it's not going to happen. Right?
It's not only not going to happen, but it is not how we manage the ethical dimensions of technology in any other area where we responsibly deploy technologies. Instead, this is where I want to make the case for the alternative solution and get away from the abstract. We need an ecosystem. What I mean by saying we need an ethics ecosystem in this space is every other space we have a robust set of components that distribute the work of doing ethics. What are those components? One, ethics infrastructure, the day-to-day operationalizations that practitioners in the field it's part of their daily life to follow them. It's, I do this, here's my checklist. I do this, I do this. Some of that checklist might include reaching out for help and teaching them how they do that. It also includes the local oversight that sort of makes that ethics infrastructure function, compliance officers in an organization. So that's one component. Second component, ethics education, enculturation, and training. If you go to med school, forget med school. If you're an undergrad and pre-med, from the minute you start taking classes, you're getting ethics training. You're getting enculturated in a way of seeing the ethical problems in your space. You're getting trained in how to carry out that checklist that's part of the ethics infrastructure from day one. So that's the next part, enculturation, training, outreach, teaching the public about the ecosystem. 3, policy regulation, whether formal or informal, that incentivize following. It mandates particular parts of the ecosystem or the infrastructure or the training, or it provides the sticks and carrots. Another component is what I'm going to call foundational to translational research. No ecosystem can cover all the ethical issues or have the answers to all the ethical issues. So you need a tool for doing new research in the ethics space and translating it into the ethics infrastructure, into the policy and regulation, into the training. A fourth component is interdisciplinary practice, having enough people of the relevant disciplines to help overcome any interdisciplinary challenges you face. And then I think what's central to every one of these ecosystems that's functioning well, and I'm happy to go into details about specific ones, is 2 things: a shared language and interdisciplinary practitioners. So a shared language, if you talk to a bioethicist about what informed consent means, they all know what it means, and everyone in that field knows what informed consent entails. When I go to talk to research about fairness, it's an hour conversation about to make sure we're even using the word the same way. And then the other thing, bioethicists, it's a field. Like they have interdisciplinary training across domains. AI ethicists, there's 5 of them. Then there's people like me who are philosophers that do AI ethics, but that's not the same thing.
This was actually speaks to one of the spaces in which I was going to push back on you a little bit, or at least, I think pushback is the right word. So the second element of the ecosystem is education. You had this comparison with undergraduate medical students. And my point was going to be the one that you've really just made, which is, but when they take those classes, there is literally decades worth of spelling out what the hell medical ethics requires, consists in. I did another podcast episode a couple of weeks ago that was on explainability in AI and informed consent. And I remarked, it's amazing that almost everyone I don't know, everyone in the US, everyone in the English speaking world, like everyone knows the phrase informed consent. Forget about undergraduates or specialists, and patients know the word or the phrase informed consent. That's a cultural achievement. And it flows, as and you said this earlier, that informed consent flows from a commitment to the value of autonomy. We want people to engage in acts of bodily self-determination, and part of that means that you've got to provide informed consent. But now here's the pushback, or at least in the short term. Long term, totally. Part of the ecosystem is they get the right kind of education, blah, blah, blah. And so that when they get to the job and they're asked to do a kind of ethical risk assessment or some certain component of that risk, they have some idea what's going on. But the problem is, while in medical ethics, we've got the Belmont principles, right? We have the respect for persons / respect for autonomy, principle of justice, but principle of beneficence and non-malevolence. We've got those, but those have been translated via regulation into particular requirements like informed consent. We've got, and that's going to aid education and the uptake, because then when they say, all right, are we manifesting respect for persons? The person who's been taking ethics in medicine has learned that's a question about informed, at least in large part, a question about informed consent. There's nothing like that, as far as I know, in the AI ethics space, where we translate some big values into some particular things that are akin to informed consent. And then when we try to do it, it comes out clumsy. Oh, everyone has to have full control over their data because there's informed consent with their data. And I'm like, who the hell wants to do that job? No one wants to do that. To have full control over all their data, that sounds terrible. So anyway, I agree. We didn't get informed consent. It took decades. Getting doctors this kind of, and nurses and other healthcare practitioners this kind of education was decades in the making. I don't see it happening anytime in the AI ethics space.
Yeah, great. I think there's several lessons in what you just said. First, I want to point out that there's a big difference in having our normative aim be cultivating that kind of ecosystem and seeing that as a solution to the problem, as opposed to our current normative aim, which is people are aimed at individual components, but no coordination across them. Like the lessons are train all the technologists, train all the ethicists. Like, so first, there's the what to aim at. And I think that we've been mistaken in what to aim at. But then there is this deep question about the interim. Like, what do we do in the interim? How do we set up things to manage the problems now? And I think first, you said decade, like it actually happened pretty quick once we decided that people were being deeply unethical about their treatment of human subjects.
Yeah, we had the Tuskegee experiments, sure, and that led to.
So there's some hope. There are many, ethics ecosystem isn't just human subject research. We have animal subject research. We have clinical care. We have embryonic stem cell research, which is a really fascinating one because during the Bush years, Bush just basically said, we're not going to fund any of this research. And so we're not going to provide any ethical guidelines. Industry, academia got together and they just built the ethics ecosystem real fast. There is hope to be drawn from the ones. There's hope. There's also terrible things had to happen in most cases before we got them. But,
I will say one success story in that arena is CRISPR.
Exactly.
There was this one guy in China who used CRISPR on a human embryo and people went freaked out. But the fact that seems to be the only case, or the fact that there was a case and people freaked out about it in the absence of any regulations or laws against it, that's freaking remarkable.
It really does speak to the power of the ethics ecosystem because that isn't part of that original ethics ecosystem, but the people that are part of that ecosystem have these really strong intersocial norms that they've deployed against one another to condemn that kind of work. I think there are really positive lessons to be drawn from those things. I do worry, what is the thing that the technologists are going to do that finally makes us respond and build an ethics ecosystem? I worry about that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but I do think
there'll be like AI-specific Cambridge Analyticas, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. We need something like that, or some community-oriented thing, or maybe it's unionization of tech workers because they're a valuable resource. And I have thoughts about those things, but I think in the interim, the key lesson from the pointing to ecosystem is that currently everyone's building these things, but without any eye towards coordination. So there's tons of AI ethics curriculum that exists.
Yeah,
we're developing tools for computer science to learn ethics, almost solely focused on computer science instead of the other broad stakeholders that actually need the ethics education in this space.
Yeah.
But none of them are thinking about the policy stuff. NIST has a risk management framework. That's not like those things are aligned in any way. So as interim steps, we can start recognizing the need for coordination, start experimenting with models. We can also build it's like medicine has distinctive ethics ecosystems for different problems. We can build project-specific ethics ecosystems. So an organization could take on the task of not training every practitioner to do ethics, but what do I need to train them to do to manage the specific ethical dimensions? And this is much more tractable than trying to train your whole workforce.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to train them in some stuff that they have to comply with. You do have to have some stuff in the background where people are doing review or oversight or things like that, but it's a very different
Yeah.
project. The thing that where I point to, and I work on a project called the National Internet Observatory, where we've tried to take these lessons to heart, and for the project, develop all these independent components to manage just this one project. So that is something we can do in the interim.
Okay, so two questions. One is about this about compliance stuff. Let me ask this question first. I just want to get more color on this. Okay, we've got this ecosystem. What was the first component of that ecosystem?
Infrastructure.
Right, infrastructure, which meant like procedures, day-to-day procedures, operations, workflow augmentation for just data scientists on the ground. So that's that, and then you've got number 2 is education, and number 3 I think was regulatory policy, sticks and carrots. And your complaint now is that there's no coordination. And as an example, NIST has this risk management framework. What do they call it? An AI assurance framework or something along those lines, or risk management?
Yeah, just call it the
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so what would it look like for those things to be coordinated? And why do we need the coordination, I suppose, is another question. Why not think let 1,000 flowers bloom in each one of those elements of the ecosystem, and there'll be natural bridges among them, as opposed to this giant, holistic, coordinated effort that seems to be big, a very big lift.
It is a big lift, but I think that it's an open empirical question whether, for example, the stuff I teach when I teach computer scientists about AI ethics, which is about being appropriately sensitive and responsive to values like fairness and explainability and things like that. If organizations just might decide, look, NIST is running the AI Safety Institute. We're just going to adopt the RMF. What's the chance that I send a student that's got my AI ethics education and they're well equipped to deploy the risk management framework that has been adopted by an organization? I have no idea. Maybe you're right. That'll maybe connect up nicely. But if they're learning from me, hey, there's this risk management framework. Here's how my key concepts can be deployed. Here's how an organization might deploy the RMF in a specific context. Here's the kind of thing practitioners are going to be asked to do. I'm then creating people that can carry out the functions of the ethics ecosystem, and in a much more clear, careful way. Like they don't have to. They don't need to learn anything about RALs to do that. They should all learn stuff about RALs, but they don't have to learn that in order to carry out those functions more clearly.
But he's so boring. It's so boring. RALs are so boring, just for the record. He might be right, but it's so boring.
Yeah,
no?
Sometimes smart people are boring. I agree.
I guess that's right. That is definitely right. Okay, let me ask you a different kind of question about this compliance stuff. One of the things that people like to push back against, or people in the AI ethics space push back against, let me say, this would be more playing devil's advocate. I want to hear your view on this, because I completely agree that they got to check their boxes. They need daily procedures and workflows, and this are the things that they do. And this is at a matter of course. This is what we do when we come in at 8 a.m. We ask these kinds of questions, something along those lines. And some people get worked up and they say, that's not ethics, that's compliance. You're draining the ethics out of AI ethics. What do you think about that?
That makes total sense as a criticism when you're not thinking ecosystemically, when you're thinking about having to solve these problems on a case-by-case basis. But like, the ethics is being done across the system. So I guess this is true. If I'm thinking from my deep philosopher hat, I'd really love everyone to be thinking about the normative nuances of every problem they confront. And that is really doing ethics. Yeah. And I do think it's a good criticism of bioethics that the operationalizations they settled on, I think there's important lesson here too, often fail, especially in new context. I think that's true. But the question we have to ask is, as a matter of solving the broad range of ethical challenges, what's the best system in place? What does it mean to do ethics of solving these problems? And that means building an ecosystem where some people are just carrying out day-to-day functions. It's a function of just doing real theory. And compliance doesn't have to be like simple, easy compliance. You can have part of a compliance mechanism be compliance with when to reach out to pull in someone to solve a more nuanced problem, or like escalation mechanism. That can be part of compliance. So I'm sympathetic with my philosopher's hat on that these ecosystems are bound to get some nuanced problems wrong because of but the bulk of it, I think, is the best bet we've got. And
I think that's exactly right. I actually don't know that it's going to be so helpful to have people engaging in subtle or attempting to engage in subtle ethical analysis when they don't have the training to do it. You are a professor. I was a professor. You've seen first-year students who don't have philosophical training engaging in argumentation. It doesn't go great. It doesn't go very well. And usually the loudest voice wins, not the most right one. Like the smart person in the corner who speaks quietly doesn't usually win over the group, and then that's what the group goes with, so to speak. So the same thing would happen. I think in a corporate setting, it's not going to be you get people with no philosophical or very little philosophical training, or knowing how to engage rationally in very hot button issues, which philosophers are adept at, and the average person simply is not. They're just going to mess it up. Like, it's not obviously better than some alternative. Let's say the alternative is a sort of coarse-grained policy that gets it right 80% of the time. All right, so it gets it wrong 20% of the time. But if you had it like, let's let the loudest, most aggressive voice win in the course of an ethical inquiry discussion, you're probably going to lose more than 80%.
I almost certainly totally agree with that. There's some sense in which I want to say something like getting it to run through the ecosystem is not getting it. It's getting it right 100% of the time because that's the right procedure to run it through to make like what you were saying before about come up with the sort of areas where there's reasonable disagreement and then you just have to make a decision among those choices. I think that's actually what's going on here too. Once you craft the ecosystem correctly, the fact that it gets it substantively wrong upon reflection by those with access to the platonic forms of ethics,
right?
Like that's a genuine problem. Like you get it substantively wrong, but it's really the right thing. It's the right procedure. It's totally excusable that they got it wrong. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. And I want to point out like another feature of that ecosystem. There are substantive normative things to do, and that's what the foundational to translational research component is meant to solve. We do need to exercise careful reasoning. We need to get the right people in the rooms to do that. We need to engage the right people, and that's a part of a good functioning ecosystem.
That all sounds right. One more point is that I think they think that companies, large organizations ought to do the right thing for the right reasons, that we're talking about something akin to good character. And I just don't think that'd be lovely, but that can't be the goal. Or at least that can't be the target. In my view,
you mean?
Yeah, exactly. There's a way in which I don't really care about their motives. Look, when you're talking about regulatory, the third element of the ecosystem is regulatory sticks and carrots. Those are not ethical reasons. Those are reasons of the wrong kind. Those are reasons for which, when you do it for that reason, you don't get moral praise. I look at it like there's an elderly person who needs help across the street. Scenario 1, you don't help them. Scenario 2, you help them because you get the praise of other people clapping. Oh, what a nice young man for helping the elderly person across the street. And then the third version is you help the elderly person across the street moved by compassion or empathy or whatever the thing is. Right now we have corporations basically doing their scenario 1. Let's get them to scenario 2. Who cares? The move from scenario 1 to scenario 2 is a huge move, and I don't really care if we ever get them to scenario 3. I don't think that we will. If we did, I don't know what kind of ecosystem change that would be, but it would be gargantuan.
I don't know. Think about the thing you were saying before about the way that doctors and people in the medical profession they see the world from the perspective of their ecosystem. In some sense, it like cultivates the motives in them. So who knows what it looks like after decades of people being computer scientists or business managers or health professionals being inculcated into an ecosystem, how that changes the way the reasons they act. They see the world like I have to save patients. Like it's just it's embodied in their values. Sometimes to the degree you get to policy questions.
I don't know, maybe you're a nicer person than me, but I think that strikes me as rose-colored glasses. Like I think a lot of cases, it's ego. I want to be the best one. I want to be the one who saves them, not someone else. I want a better record than the other doctor. I want to run this department. I want the praise of the doctors or the nurses or whatever.
Yeah, maybe we just have different views about human psychology, but I ultimately agree that like what matters is the substantive thing that matters most right now is getting people from we're not doing anything to doing roughly the right thing. We can deal with their reasons later, or we can think you're a shit person even though you did the right thing. Sorry about the swearing. It's hard to
No, I don't care.
Like you're a crappy person, but thanks for doing the right thing. Like I'm okay with that as a first step. And I think maybe my hopes that the ecosystem actually cultivates the proper values is misguided, but if it accomplishes the first order thing, great.
I think that here's a difference though, and why I think it's a bigger lift, although admittedly we're engaged in mostly empirical speculation at this point. The medical ecosystem is like everyone's got this unified mission, more or less, of help the patients. And so doctor, nurse, whatever, you're helping patients. The AI ecosystem, it's literally every single industry. It's across the whole economy. There isn't a shared thing. So the thing that you would have to get among the AI practitioners is something I think would have to trickle down from an even larger ecosystem, which would essentially be like the entire country. So that we now think that we'd have to completely change the culture of what we think the obligations of businesses are to people, society at large. We'd have to think that businesses have to take the kind of attitude towards consumers, clients, and society at large that doctors and nurses take towards their patients. And then I can see it trickling down to it's in the AI ecosystem that we think about this stuff for the right reasons, blah, blah, blah. But just AI practitioner as such, I don't think there's enough there to identify as the AI people really care about people or something along those lines. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I think it's a little unfair to talk about an AI ethics ecosystem because I actually think it's going to be lots of sub ecosystems and like how we divide that up is a hard practical problem.
Yeah, sure.
But in medicine, we have multiple. It's not just human subject, animal subject research, or arguably people are not oriented towards people necessarily. They do basic science research that they just think it's cool, but they still exist in an ethics ecosystem about animal subject use and reuse and things like that. But also, I think even on the business side, we do this, like pharma is governed by that medical ethic. Now, it's not perfect. I can say things about that, but they're governed partly by that ecosystem. But it is a business-oriented thing. Despite what they say, it's probably not all that patient. It's partly going to be patient-oriented, but it's also profit-oriented. But they're still see the world through a particular ethics ecosystem. The way we like discuss lapses in ethics in pharma are like, we can articulate very easily what they did wrong. They like committed fraud. Yeah. So I think I have a little bit of hope that there is specific AI ethics ecosystems. The challenge is, how do you train people given that they might end up one sector versus another, and they might have slightly different variants on what the operationalizations look like. Those are all hard practical problems, but you can only solve them if you're thinking in a coordinated fashion about what should my education regime look like given what we know we've got to solve in the day-to-day.
Okay, so if I back up a little bit, I want to say something like this, that your general view is that the reason that we're screwing up AI ethics generally across the board is that it's too, I don't know, sniper focused, too niche, too narrow. Maybe just say narrow. Maybe narrow is the right word. It's just the approach is far too narrow. And we gave a kind of example of that where fairness is thought about in terms of making sure the model is fair as opposed to the system in which the model is embedded or something along those lines. And the overly technical approach of trying to measure fairness when in some cases measurement is not the right kind of approach to see if you've got fairness. I think there's other examples. You could say the same thing about explainability, right? There are super technical ways of doing explanation, but those explanations are often completely inaccessible to the person who needs them. And so those don't count as in some sense, useful or ethically good explanations. So the point is something like we've been too focused and too narrow, too data science-y in our approach to ethics in AI ethics. But then the move is not then to say what we need is more philosophers necessarily, although that's part of the story. It's not, we need to just supplement the data science people with the ethics people. The point is that this is, I've used this phrase more often in this conversation than any other. There's a much bigger lift that has to be engaged in, and it's the lift of creating this giant ecosystem, which will include the input of ethicists or philosophers or whatever, but it's going to be, we're going to need regulators to create the right kinds of regulations. We're going to need educators to create the right kind of education. We need that education, to your point earlier, dovetail with the kind of regulations that people will be expected to comply with once they're practicing. And what was the first one again? I keep forgetting the first element.
Ethics infrastructure, like the data.
And we need ethics infrastructure within organizations where the ethics infrastructure is going to speak to the regulatory requirements as well as the education that spoke to those regulatory requirements. And so we need to do that. Okay. And then you started to talk a little bit about this, about how we're supposed to pull this off.
Yeah.
So can you say more about that? You're already engaged in the sort of big collaborative effort to grow the elements of the ecosystem in parallel?
Yeah, so I'll say first, you say it's a big lift, and the version I want is a big lift, but there's a light lift. We're going to get an ethics ecosystem. Companies would like to know the things they have to comply with to be able to operate without sort of ambiguity about whether what they're doing is okay. And here's the problem that comes from that. We're going to get an ecosystem, but once an ecosystem is entrenched, they're extremely hard to change. And so if it's bad in some dimension, it's going to stay bad for a long time. This is the problem. Bioethics is, in some sense, amazing. But as an overall grade, I'll give it a B- because it's bad at public health ethics because it wasn't designed to manage that.
Sure.
And moving it to address that is so hard. And there's a sense in which we're getting this thing. We're going to have all those components. We already got training. We'll end up with some kind of mishap in coordination and alignment. The big lift is making sure we point it in the right direction from the start so it's adaptable, changeable, gets the right answers substantively for where we are now, but it can grow into the future. I do think that's a big lift. How do we get there? First, here would just be a nice first step. Everyone's got, so like you said, like things are too sniperish, but there are people trying to develop broad frameworks like the RMF, or there's a billion AI ethics frameworks that people are told to deploy, but there's none of those frameworks say, here's what it would take to develop the human capacity to actually deploy our model. Like even providing like the equivalent of a model card that says, here's the kind of training someone needs to deploy this. Here's what practitioners need to learn to deploy it. Like even thinking through those problems when explaining your framework would be a massive improvement over what we have now.
Yeah. One of the things that we're always telling clients is it's the standard thing is people process technology and they've got the technology bit, but they have neither the people nor the processes, or they haven't trained the people that they have in the right sort of way and the right kind of processes. Yeah. It's always missing.
So every company picks up one of these frameworks and then they're like starting from scratch and developing the people and the processes.
Yeah. One of the problems is that like the NIST RMF is great, When I read it, it's one of the very few things that I read where I thought, this is like this legit smart people who know what they're talking about wrote this thing.
Absolutely.
So I was impressed. On the other hand, number one, no one who's not already in the space and gets this shit will understand that framework because it's too smart. It's written by academics. It's written, or at least it's written with academic rigor. And so if you don't know how to read something with academic rigor, there's important sentences in there that are literally important things in a single sentence that unless you read like a responsible academic, you're just going to miss it. That's one problem. The other problem is that it's necessarily generic, right? It's not only it's organization neutral, it's industry neutral, and companies are created in different ways. And so you can't just copy paste this framework onto the organization. You actually have to do the work of tailoring. There's a lot of tailoring to be done, a lot of customization. Like you can't just take this suit off the shelf and put it on. Like it's got to be custom made, or it's not going to get adopted at all, or it's going to get adopted inefficiently, or it's going to get adopted in a way that's not actually effective in achieving the goals you wanted to achieve. Yeah. So,
Couldn't agree more. I love that framework. It's like responsive to a lot of the nuanced ethical demands.
yeah.
But because of that, it faces the exact challenges. So like we actually need
Yeah.
like management frameworks for how businesses take frameworks like that and put it into place. We need education that sort of is oriented towards those management frameworks and things like that. Other things like we could learn in the interims, like currently almost all AI ethics education, except at the executive level or corporate level, but in undergrad is oriented towards computer science students and engineers who are
Yep.
the least impactful people. They can be impactful in some
No,
ways.
they're not executives. Yeah.
Executives
Yeah.
or in the medical field, practitioners that have to use the models and are either
Yeah.
going to be skeptical or too unskeptical about the use of the models. Like
Yeah.
the education base for our current training, even if it were uncoordinated, would benefit a ton just by broadening.
Yeah.
Humanists do not get good AI education to properly deploy this.
No.
Like, I think humanists have useful tools to deploy, but they're not able. This is the technical insensitivity bit. Like,
yeah. Completely agree. Let me ask you another question about building this ecosystem. So I'll give you an example. I want to know. Here's my question. What are the obstacles you think to building that ecosystem well? I could think of one. I could think of a bunch, but as one example, I think the hubris of data scientists is one major problem. So to pick up on an earlier thread, you talk about bias in AI. The data scientists think they got it. They're like, the practitioners like, we got it. Yeah. No, we got tools. We got bias isn't a problem. We figured it out. Done. Explainability. We got it. We got Lime. We got Shaft. Like we can do different levels. Like we got explainability. We're done here. And so one of the major problems to making that right kind of ecosystem is that you've got to get the buy-in of people who think that they know everything. They're super smart. They know everything AI. We're good here. We don't need any more help with bias or explainability as an example. So I think hubris is one obstacle. I suspect you think that's the same. But what other obstacles do you think there are to building the ecosystem in a way that pointing it in the direction you want it to be pointed?
one of the I worry about the most is economic disincentive. That's as a philosopher, like thinking about how to craft policy and regulation and how do you rein in corporations that are profit driven and they're invested in hype of AI. That's a really hard problem that hopefully someone knows how to manage. That's not me. But I do see that kind of arrogance. But here's one thing I think this is where the education piece fits in. Like Northeastern, we hire a ton of people that are really good on the technical sensitivity side and the ethics sensitivity side. You put those people in a room with those computer science and engineering students, and they can explain in ways that are responsive to their technical understanding why they've got it wrong, and they start to listen. So I really do think that hubris is addressable at the education level, but you got to have the humanists that can do like you send in the average philosopher to talk to them, and you might as well just read Rawls. Right? Like it's so far away from like their understanding, but I can talk to students in a way that suggests that I know enough about machine learning that I don't walk around outside looking at clouds all day. And it builds a kind of trust that diminishes that hubris.
Yeah, I 100% agree that you can put it bluntly, you can put them in their place and reveal to them, you don't know as much as you think you know about this stuff. Obviously, it takes the right kind of language, the right kind of communicative skills. The average philosopher who just got their PhD and does super abstract justice issues in AI or whatever, that's not the appropriate person to talk to them. Typically, I've actually said to people, oh yeah, we just hired a PhD in philosophy. I said, did they just get their PhD? Yes. Like, that's a terrible idea. You did the wrong thing. I'm sorry, but you did the wrong thing. Anyway, those are people who are subject to you because they're students. And so you're right. I agree that in order to build the ecosystem, it's giving those people the right kind of education so that they know what they don't know. In the short term, it's a big problem because corporations they're in principle full-grown adults who are not students who don't have to listen to you. And so it's harder to get them to the table to have the conversation, to show them it's much easier for the senior executive on the tech side of the house to be like, no, my people have it. We got it. We've got a team dedicated to it. We have a team dedicated to it. We've been working on it. We have an internal group. We got it. It's like,
Totally.
and it's impossible to tell them, no, you're probably wrong.
Yeah. There's certainly going to be some organizations that are immune to that. I've done corporate trainings like for
Yeah.
research level engineers, like the PhDs doing research
Yeah.
at
Yep.
companies that I'm not allowed to say the name of. And I can get them to listen. Some of them
Yep.
brought me in because they already were responsive. And of
Yep.
course, there's a selection bias. The people who are going to come listen to me are
Exactly.
don't hate me.
Exactly. Yes,
But
exactly.
some of
Yeah.
those people, like when you're talking to the PhD researchers doing foundational research at these companies, those people have power, right?
Mhm.
Like companies care about data, they care about model building, and they care about those particular people.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
like so I think there's a lot of room for, I share your worries about the space. There's some
Yeah.
places that are going to be immune to these interventions, but we can ask questions about, we're building education, how do we make it scale? How do we build kind of the corporate interventions that are actually effective? How do we,
Yeah.
like the thing you were saying earlier, forgetting about motives, how do we convince them that this is in their corporate interest to listen to us?
Yeah. That's why I said earlier, I think it's all doable. That and all of this stuff is totally doable. I like to say that people think that AI ethics or creating or scaling AI ethics or AI ethical risk programs or whatever you want to call them, responsible AI in a corporation is really hard. And I always say it's not. Like we know how to do it. We know how to do it. The problem is that the problem is not ignorance, it's a lack of political will. I said this earlier. It's a lack of political will. Yeah. If you get a company that says we want to do this for real, and when they say that, they mean it, which means they're putting real resources behind it, time, energy, money. Yeah, of course they can do it. It's just that I'm in the same situation as you where we're seeing a small subset of the set of all corporations, right? Even if you add up all the people out there doing this work, it's still, I think, a pretty small subset of the set of all corporations. And so getting the buy-in, the political buy-in from, I don't know, some number greater than 50% of corporations out there, that I don't think is going to happen without the carrot and the stick, especially the stick.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about that. I try to draw hope from the cases where, like you said, the CRISPR case or the embryonic stem cell research case.
Yeah.
There, we already had them heavily invested in an ethics ecosystem of their own, and then we just drew on that, which comes with its own
Yeah.
risk. Like you can draw on an ethics ecosystem, and get things wrong. That happens all the time.
Yeah.
I wish I knew more about other ethics ecosystems. Like the military has a robust ethics ecosystem.
Yes. Yep.
Right. I don't know how it came about, war crime stuff, but it's really robust. I don't
Yep.
understand it.
Absolutely.
It's got all the components I mentioned. It's got every
Yeah.
single
Yeah.
one of those components. And I don't know how they're not the kind of thing that are subject to the sticks and carrots we might think are the most relevant kinds of sticks and carrots.
Yeah.
So I think it's a real genuine research program to figure out what's within the scope of possibility for getting these things done in the absence of strict regulation. But maybe our best hope is maybe the EU has shown that they're willing to put a little bit more teeth into things than the US, at least so
Yeah.
far. And because of the way these corporations work, sometimes that has knock-on effects. Like sometimes they just comply with both. And so
Yeah.
maybe we should focus on the EU, and maybe that'll be enough. It'll be cheaper for corporations to build the ethics ecosystem that's responsive to
Yeah.
the EU, and then it'll just bleed over to there. Like I try to be as hopeful as I can because I do agree it's a big lift and there's lots of components, and the government piece is the hardest piece for me. Like I don't see much hope of us getting sticks and carrots in the US. There's the AISI consortium, which is meant to help provide guidance, but
Yeah.
how much teeth it'll have and how binding it'll be remains to be seen.
So I completely agree about the military. I've talked to two other people on this podcast, one Jeremy Kofsky and one Heather Roth. Jeremy was really Marine Corps, had lots to say about how seriously the sort of troops on the ground take ethics and how important it is for those troops to know terms of engagement, etc. Take it very seriously. People are answerable to the decisions that they make in a very real way. Heather Roth, very clear that the procedures by which, let's say, new technology gets implemented or taken on into the system, especially when we're talking about weapon systems, and especially within weapon systems when we're talking about nuclear systems, very stringent procedures. It's not they hear some startup pitch something, they're like, great, we'll take it. It's not, it's much more stringent. So I agree that the military has that kind of culture in many ways. But and then I think, okay, so why can't we have it with AI? I'm going to say the same kind of thing that I said earlier, which is that there's a very core identity and mission in healthcare, right? It's save the patients. In military, it's something like protect our civilians or protect our country. There's this like unified identity and mission that makes it the case that there's a strong ethical code that permeates the systems. I don't think that the AI, that the role of AI practitioner is sufficiently coherent or a single thing in the
Maybe.
way that being a doctor, being a soldier is.
Maybe that's true, and maybe what that means is that's why we need multiple ethics ecosystems. But I want to point out the value we coalesced around that commitment in healthcare. Pre the
Yeah.
ethics ecosystem, we cared about
Yeah.
patients, but we also cared about just doing cool science, whatever the cost.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah. Yeah.
military,
Yeah.
like we do things that are stringently protective of other people's citizens. And we coalesced around that, like where we might not have before. We didn't. We just said, do whatever gets the job done for your side. So I do think that like part of that you can negotiate down to a more shared set of values. Maybe there won't be a single one for I think it's unrealistic. There's going to be a single like dominant value for all AI because it's too many sectors. But I do think we could have a small set of values on domain specific AI deployment. Like maybe generative AI has its own and it's something like truth or something like that. Maybe deep fakes is the
Right.
thing to motivate.
Yeah.
So I don't know. But I do have a little hope that it's a little more tractable than there's just too
Yeah.
many values and too many applications.
I've been pushing back and really trying to air my skepticism, but I agree that long term there's reason to hope. Because I agree that if you can, I think it's going to take a generation, I think, because I think it's going to be too hard to educate the people who are already in corporations. Again, we can do it, but I don't think we have enough political will across the set of all corporations. But if you're taking all the graduating classes from, let's say, now for the next 20 years, are moving into those corporations first as junior people and then as more senior data scientists, senior executives. If you give them the right kind of education, then we've got a shot at it. But it's at least a generation.
Yeah. And then the question is what to do in the interim. And I think there's certain groups that they're going to be immune to these things. But what we can do in the interim for that generation is build models, radically experiment with. I don't know if your audience knows this, but here's how it works when you got to solve a machine learning problem as part of a grant. I'm on lots of grants. When you need to solve a machine learning problem, you bring in an expert in machine learning and then they just hire graduate students that their domain is vision or whatever. So what they do is they reach out to a philosopher. We need someone to manage ethics. And for us, there is no one person that manages ethics. And my discipline doesn't allow me to just hire grad students to solve these problems. Because grad students, for those in the audience don't know, in philosophy, grad students just do their own thing. There's no co-authoring is not part of our discipline really.
No.
Everyone does
And they're
their
not
own
very
thing.
good. Not very good. They're just not very good.
That's right.
And they don't know how to talk to non-philosophers. Yeah.
That's right. So we need new models for like how to do our own disciplinary work, and we need to experiment with that. Like, how do you build a cluster of ethical expertise that can actually help solve for the broad range of values and integrate it into technical? Like, there's just so much experimentation we could do that will be useful for that next generation when they're trying to build these things.
Yeah,
we're not going to solve all the problems tomorrow, but I think there are steps, and I think keeping the ecosystem in mind really informs what those steps look like and what to aim at to ready ourselves for that broader thing.
I'll say one last thing, which is philosophers also need an education around how businesses actually work. How not just the technical underpinnings of AI. How does an LLM work? It's how does a data science team work? How do they fit inside of a corporate structure? Yeah. If you don't know those things, then it's like you get these sort of coarse-grained proclamations by philosophers, which are like, the company should do X. It's like, how do you think that? What do you mean? They should stop doing that. Who should stop doing what and when? The company, the people who did it. Okay. Yeah. But it's not.
I totally agree. I think we do need more training about that. Like I've written a couple organizational facing things, but always with a consultant from Accenture. And like part of the conversation is them calibrating us to that's not a thing you get to say.
That's not how companies work. Yeah.
But another thing, like I'll air another gripe with the humanities in general. Philosophy's getting a little better about this, but not great. Is like we come with excellent critical perspectives. We can articulate the ways in which these systems are bad. But as soon as they're asked, like computer scientists don't come to me with, the ones that come to me want to do the right thing. And they're like, how do I do it? And I'm like, the way you're doing it is very bad. And then they say, okay, tell me what to do. And we're like, I don't know. Like we have to be a little bit more better about experimenting with providing positive guidance about what to do, even if we're going to get it wrong, because I'd rather help make that decision and get it wrong than some of the other people that are going to say, yes, I'll help you make that decision.
Yes. When I moved from academia to advising corporations, I realized that what I as a trained philosopher meant by this is practical advice is not at all what they conceive of as practical advice, right? For us to give practical advice is to give this abstract conceptual framework that should guide deliberation, roughly, right? So it's super abstract. They want like what do I do? Step one, practical advice in a corporate setting is, you want to sit down in the chair? Okay. Step one, begin to shift your weight to the back of your heels. Step two, begin lowering your back. Step three, that's what practical advice is. It's like the difference between philosophy and self-help books. Philosophers will talk about the good life, but don't putting the Stoics to the side, because everyone is all worked up about the Stoics for stupid, misguided reasons. But don't read Rousseau or Mill or Kant or whatever if you want to know how to live a good life. Get an abstract conception of it, sure. But that's why they're self-help books, because they're allegedly supposed to be the how. Now, of course, they usually get their goals wrong of their shit. But that's the level at which I think philosophers have to understand that people need advice communicated to them on ethical or philosophical issues. It's when we say practical advice, it means something different. They want the self-help version of ethics, because they need to know exactly, especially the engineers. The engineers are like, give me the steps.
Yeah. And philosophers in some sense are right to be hesitant to give that self-help type guidance, because we're not good. We actually, you need to know so many things to translate from what we have to what's there, but we need to be able to engage in those conversations. Like, I had some engineers approach me once and I said, yeah, you do need an ethicist, and that's a cool problem, but you got ethicists. Like, we went to them and they told us to maximize expected utility. And I was like, yes, I will join your team and help you, because I'm so sorry that's the advice you got.
That's hilarious. Not surprising.
Unsurprising, exactly.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say, this has gone on longer than I anticipated, but is that, and I wrote this in an early public-facing article. It was something like, philosophers and ethicists ask the question, what ought we to do? And that's just not the question that data scientists typically need to answer. They need to ask something like, how do we mitigate and manage the ethical risks? It's like, they're not constructing the ideal world. Philosophers are involved in talking about how things ideally ought to be. And the data scientists, companies have just competing priorities, and they've got to weigh the ethical consideration against the other ones. And they're going to take risks, and they're going to try to manage those risks or minimize them, but they'll make trade-offs. And so philosophers and ethicists in particular often, I think, start off with this wrong way of conceiving of the endeavor. It's not, how do we make an ideal world? It's, how do we bring this down to an acceptable level of risk?
Yeah, I think that's true. I do, like, we've been pretty hard on philosophers, which I think in general is warranted. I do think there's a new generation of, especially in the AI ethics space, where we're getting people that have enough technical training and interest in solving the problems and enough normative background. Like, we hire the people that are my favorite people, fortunately. But so Katie Creel works on this. I don't know if you've seen this work on algorithmic monoculture.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so this is very cool. There's a kind of fairness concern that's not mapping onto our standard conception of fairness, which is this. Everybody makes arbitrary decisions, like human decision makers and things that are encaptured in the statistical patterns that models deploy. Some level of arbitrariness has to be acceptable because it can't be avoided. But when you deploy a model across a whole decision sector, that arbitrariness will concentrate on the same individuals. It could be random factors about them, exclude them from the benefits of that. So it could be hiring, it could be loans. So they're now excluded unfairly from access to this thing because we have an algorithmic monoculture making all the decisions. So she's...
Oh, I see. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So she's highlighted, it doesn't happen in human decision because our arbitrariness is all different.
So if you've got this hiring manager biased this way, that hiring manager biased that way, and you've got a million hiring managers biased this way, that. The other thing, it in some sense averages out so that no one
people can still get jobs. Yeah.
Exactly. But if you took one of those hiring managers and made their method of hiring the only method, you'd get no red shoed people or no black people or no women or whatever it is. I'm familiar with that issue. Yeah, I didn't know to call it algorithmic monoculture.
Yeah, good. So Katie has been working on articulating not just that that's a conceptual fairness problem, but what kinds of models are likely to result in monoculture empirically, and then what kinds of introduction of arbitrariness or randomness to those systems. Like, how do you develop models that are making the same decisions but different enough to combat the arbitrariness? So I think there is some really good, but it is not the standard for our discipline. And she does work that is, like, by our discipline's normal standards, isn't recognized as the kind of thing that gets you tenure or promotion or whatever.
Right.
Our discipline, yeah.
We'll have to have her next on the podcast.
She's amazing. Her and Sina Fazilpour, amazing.
I talked to Sina a few years back. I think I read an article by him that was really good. The co-author was someone. Anyway, John, I suspect that we could talk for another 3 hours, but we should probably wrap it up. Thanks so much. This has been really fun, really interesting.
My pleasure. It's been such a great time. Thanks for the conversation.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.